This is a 2003 Chevy Tracker. I'm making this video because, like most people that search YouTube for car repair videos, when I was doing it, I was trying to find my exact make and model and year. I found a lot of similars. I found some other trackers in different years. I found some Suzukis, whatever. But, you know, I wanted the same car and I couldn't find it, so I'm making this video to kind of fill that gap. I'm not a mechanic. That's going to become very obvious. But I am one of those people that got in a situation where I'd snapped a brake line and it either needed to be done or needed to be towed. So I got it done. I learned some things along the way. So this video is kind of just my video that I would have made to myself before I embarked on all of this. So if you've got a 2003 Chevy Tracker and you've got brake line issues, or you're doing something with the rear brakes, the drums, maybe this video is something you can learn something from. Otherwise, it's really not for you. So let's get into it. What happened is the brake lines in this 18-year-old vehicle started to weep in the rear. That's never a good thing, so I decided to replace the brake lines. So you know, you have to remove the bolts to replace the brake lines, the flange bolts, and that turned out to be a pain in the butt. You know, because they hadn't been removed in years. So you ended up with something like this. After I got done with it, where it's all stripped off. I tried this in several different ways to remove these. You know, I was always told, you know, use one of these style wrenches where the end is notched out. If you don't have one that's already notched out, you can notch out the end of a close-in wrench. But this gives, you know, that way you can get over the brake line and remove it. So I ended up notching out one, giving that a try, and that just didn't have the torque you needed. Kind of before we get into that, before you do any of this stuff, you should hit everything with liquid wrench right when you're first evaluating the project and give it a couple taps with a hammer. That way everything has time to penetrate and you're not just trying to rush things. But anyway, I tried to use that open end and closed end wrench on it, and that really wasn't a good deal. They were just too seized up for that. You end up stripping out the bolts. A lot of the early stuff I did, and there's only a couple different brake fittings back here, but a lot of the early stuff I did, I ended up using vice grips on, which is never a good thing, but it was done. The best thing that I found was to actually snap off the brake line and then use a nice six-sided socket, not one of the sided sockets with more sides, you know, so that you don't have to turn it as much. A nice six-sided socket, that way you get the perfect fit. And one of these kind of breaker bar style ratchets here. Well, it's not a ratchet, it doesn't have the gears in it, but you don't want to use one with gears because you're going to wreck it. But you use one of these breaker bar style ones, you use a hammer, apply consistent pressure, and you tap it. Basically you're making an impact wrench, and that seemed to free up the last of the bolts. So snap off the brake line, and then you can get the socket over it and then get that undone. Another thing that I ran into in the course of all this, well, let's finish up the brake lines first. So it's 3/16 inch brake line. You have to flare it. I had one of these flare kits. I bought this last year because I've been planning on doing this project for a while. Yeah, I went around with weepy brake lines for a year. But I bought this last year, and unfortunately the very first flare, well, the second flare that I tried to do, I broke the 3/16 die that came with the setup. There should be a pin there sticking out of this thing. So that was garbage, and it was past the return window. I ended up finding this tool online. This is the Titan 3/16 double flaring tool, and it is hardcore. It's a thing of beauty. I will promote this thing here. If they gave me money, that'd be sweet, but they're not going to. Anyway, that is the right tool for the job. You get a perfect flare every time. You put these, you know, flare fittings on there. Interesting thing, when you look up this vehicle, everything says it's an invert flare, and if you check if an invert flare is the same thing as a double flare, well, the first thing that comes up says it isn't. There's several other things that says it is. The website, the Amazon page for this Titan flaring tool says it's an invert double flare, which is kind of a mixture of the two things. It says if it doesn't work, it leaks. So I'll find out if it leaks. Anyway, when you're bending the brake line, it's easy to bend by hand, but there's something people don't realize. It's called work hardening. So after you bend it in one direction, bending it in the opposite direction again is going to be much harder. So just think about where you bend it beforehand. The bolts that connect the brake line to the frame are definitely pretty rusted out. I had to get some new ones, so I picked these up from AutoZone. This is the style that holds the brake lines to the frame, and it's also the same style that holds the wheel cylinder to the actual brake thing, the back of the brake pads, brake shoes. Anyway, so those are the replacement bolts for when you strip them off or cut off the heads or wreck them in any way. So you take the brake line, you smooth it to the frame. I used a couple zip ties where I needed to, but mostly I was able to kind of weave it between where it should be. Once the brake line's in place, you flare the fittings. And let's get to this right now. So this is the wheel cylinder. This is what actually this is the driver's side wheel cylinder, and this is what actuates and then pushes out the brake shoes. So when I was doing the initial teardown of all this stuff, I tried to loosen up the bleeder right there, which is something that would need to be done at the end of the job, and instead it just spun off. I pulled this out with the intention of tapping that and pulling out that bleeder valve and then putting a new one in. But I also ended up having to cut off this bolt. I couldn't get that bolt out, and because of that, it pulls right out. So technically you could take out both these bolts or cut off both these bolts and just buy new brake wheel cylinders for both sides, which might be the best way to do it, because these are like 12 to 20 bucks depending on where you buy them. That prevents you from having to unscrew 3 of these flare fittings. Anyway, so I replaced this. It's kind of a one-to-one replacement. It didn't come with screws. That's another reason why I needed, well, bolts. It didn't come with bolts. That's another reason I needed to buy bolts. So I replaced this one-to-one, but the opposite side is still the original one that came with the vehicle. So you replace this, flare the lines, attach the brake lines, but you still have to do the back brakes. So my back brakes were pretty much shot at that time. So I decided it's probably a good deal to just change them out. So down here, I'm not pulling this thing apart again, but down here, excuse the angle, is basically the way that this would be if it were lifted up and put up there into the actual brake setup. So this just gives you an idea of where the springs should be. So the top spring is this one with the spring on one side, spring on the other side, and a void space in the middle. This is where the adjusting screw assembly actually goes, which is a part that did not come with the kit. I had to reuse the same one that I had. At the bottom, there's another spring. This one is kind of a long blank, middle spring area, long blank. Both of these are hooked into like these crevices all the way in the back. So these are the 2 main springs. There's also this little guy. This spring is for the adjuster arm on the adjusting screw assembly. And this kind of hooks into this spot right here. And then there's this last spring over here. This is an oddball looking spring. So it looks like this. It's kind of got this crooked end, but it doesn't have an actual hook on the end. That goes into this bottom one and then kind of sits in there like that. That hooks onto the parking brake strut. So when I took the brakes up, the first thing I did was pull these pins out. So there's one of these on each side. The pin comes in from behind and goes in through the front part and then twists, and then that's what actually holds the brakes in place. So you take a screwdriver, you push down on it, you take a pair of needle nose and you twist it and you let it, flip to the back. So you pull those, and then you have to use a pair of needle nose and pull these springs here, and then you're able to pull the brakes away from it. The side with the parking brakes, so there's 2 sides on this. There's what I call the complicated side, which is this side. That side has the adjusting screw assembly, it has the adjustment arm. And then there's the simple side over here, which is like the parking brake side. The parking brake side, there's a hole down here at the bottom. Well, there's a hole on both sides, but this one down at the bottom actually connects to your parking brake. So there's a little locking, not a pin, flange, whatever, that has to slide over a pin right here, and that's what connects it to the parking brake. So once you remove that, you can pull the brake assembly out. So we're going to tilt back up to the brakes over here. And you can see the new springs are all colorful and beautiful. So there's green springs here. That's a double spring up at the top. Key learning is these cutouts here and the actual hub are very useful and necessary to actually go around and get to all the different components. It's turning a little slow because there is a tire on the other side now. So basically when I reassembled this, let's get the camera off of the tripod. When I reassembled this, down here is that pin that I was talking about. So let's get a focus on it. So here's the pin that comes in from behind, and this is what connects to the parking brake. So you push that part through, and that's like this big metal plate through this bottom part, and then you lock it in place. Once that's locked in place, then you can take the brake and you can set it on here. You can push that pin from behind and you can lock it in place. Then I repeated the process for the other side in terms of locking that side in place over here. Once the brakes are locked in place, there's still a lot of play in them. You can move them basically wherever you want. All it does is prevent them from dropping when you let go of them. So there's two things you have to get in place. One is the parking brake strut. So let's flip this thing around again, and hopefully I can get a nice view of it. So that gold component that's located just beneath the green spring and just above the red spring is the parking brake strut. The parking brake strut, it's not symmetrical. This part that sticks out here, that's facing towards the camera right now, actually has a tiny little crook area on the back. And that is what this green spring connects to. That's that little oddball spring down here that kind of goes in different than the other springs. So that spring is what connects to the parking brake strut. So that's the entire reason for that. Come on, focus. So you push the parking brake strut in, you kind of turn it. You can pull these brakes apart still, and then you get it in there so that it sits in that crook. That crook right here is actually on the part of the parking brake that's connected through that pin there. So that's what it's sitting in, and that's locked into the actual brake. On the other side, the parking brake strut, you can see it right there. This is also locked into the plate on the back of this brake. So there are a couple pieces that didn't come with the rebuild kit. One is the parking brake strut, 2 is the plate on the back of this brake, 3 would be the plate on the back of the other brake, and 4 would be this little adjusting arm up here. 5 would be the adjusting screw assembly up there. So there's quite a few parts that are kind of reused on this, but most of them looked okay. Anyway, the parking brake strut back here locks into this portion here. There's a little groove for it, and then it has to lock in, like I said, so that the other side has that part where the spring can catch on it. Nothing's actually locked into this part, even though it looks like it should be. The brakes just rest on it for spacing. That's good to know, because when I first looked at it, when I first tore it down, I had forgotten about that. Come on, focus. So once you got the parking brake strut in place, then you can get the adjusting screw assembly in place. So the adjusting screw assembly, and this is probably the hardest part to see, it has 2 different sides to it. One side is symmetrical, this side over here. So this side just has a fork, just a nice fork that goes over the brake. So if you look down at these brakes, that is where one side of the adjusting screw assembly goes. That is where the other side of the adjusting screw assembly goes. This side is just a fork, so it doesn't matter the orientation, and it spins. It's got a screw in it. So you just, push it onto this side. This side, however, does have a specific orientation. Up here, you can see this adjusting arm here. It has an area here where it has some play. And this is all part of the adjusting screw assembly. So there's a part that comes out, a fork that comes out that has a gap, and that's where the adjusting screw, the arm is for the adjusting screw assembly. And then it comes forward, and then there's an area with no gap, and that's what it rests against. So that's what you have to have, you know, facing out towards you. You also need to adjust this enough right there. You have to adjust the screw enough with a screwdriver or before you put it in place, so that your brakes are close enough together so that you can actually get the drum back over it, and also so you can get the screws on the thing. And this arm, you can see there, is actually what does the adjustment. So that pushes down on those little rivets there. So you have to make sure when you pull everything apart that this is lubricated. So this should pull apart into two separate pieces, the adjusting screw assembly. The top actually floats on there. And if it's not floating, if it's seized up, one side of mine was seized up, you need to pull it out. You need to, you know, clean it out with some steel wool or use a Dremel tool, and then you just put a tiny touch of lube on there so that it doesn't seize up again, because that's actually what adjusts your brakes. So once you have the adjusting screw assembly in there and your parking brake strut, then it's time to put on all of your springs. These springs have a lot of tension in them. So you you hook one side on, you push it behind here, and then I ended up using a pair of pliers to grab the other end of the screw, heave it, and then drop it into place. It was actually helpful in some cases to kind of use this, so I was able to turn the hub and use that to push my hand to lock these screws in place. So you get that screw in place up here, the green screw spring. You get that spring in place, you get this red spring in place down here that goes all the way across. This green spring is probably the easiest spring to get in place, so you push it in and you hook it in, and then you use a pair of needle nose, and then you drop it back there so that it's locked back here. This spring over here is kind of a pain in the butt, so you can feed this spring in from the top, lock it on here right onto the brake itself, so down here, and then use a pair of needle nose and you pull it up, and it actually locks, come on, right there. You can see on the adjusting screw arm where it's kind of locked in place. So when it adjusts, that's what pulls it down and makes the adjustment. So basically from here, I mean, the cylinder pushes out, pushes the brakes against the walls of the drum. That's what stops the car. The adjusting screw assembly is what keeps the brakes pushed out a little bit more as they wear, so that they make good contact and you don't have any kind of lag in your stopping time. It's all pretty good in terms of how it all goes together, but you have to pay attention. This side, there's an L here, and then the plate on the back side of this brake also has an L to tell you it's on the left side. Although the parking brake has to go on the right side because it has like a curvature to it, so it has to fit over here. So by default that goes on the left side. On the other side, things are flipped around. This actually goes on the right side, and it has an R on it to tell you that it goes on the right side, and then the parking brake goes on the left side over there. Some other little bits and pieces. So even though this is all like locked in place with the springs and everything, there's still play to it. You make sure that that's centered when you put the drum over it. Otherwise you'll think that something's wrong, because you can't get it over it when it's not centered, but it's easy enough to just push it and get it back to center. After everything's put together on both sides, so in addition to this video, do one side at a time and use the other side for reference if you need to. Clean everything down with brake cleaner when you're pulling it out to get rid of all the brake dust. Once you've got both sides done, you still have to bleed the air out of the brake lines, so that's what the bleeder valve is for. I don't know even know if you can see it, but it's back here. But that's what the bleeder valve is for. You have a partner go in the car, you insert brake fluid, they pump the brakes, you open that bleeder valve, you let air out until you get consistent brake fluid. And then you have to make the actual adjustments on the brakes. So what it recommends to do online, and I haven't given this a try yet, is to put a tire on here, rotate it in reverse, and then hit the brakes periodically, and that should adjust out the screw adjuster arm to make everything nice and tight. Another day, another video. I wasn't really expecting to make a follow-up to this, but yesterday, while commissioning this and bringing it all online, I had a couple more things I wanted to share, so I thought I'd make another video the next day. So the brakes were, the tires were put back on, the brake lines were bled. To bleed the brake lines, I just attached a clear piece of plastic tubing to the nipple on the back, and then I opened that up just barely, and then while the car was running, I pumped the brakes while standing outside, so kind of like stood sideways so I could see that tubing at the same time. And I'd pump, stop, pump, stop, and I just watched the bubbles until the bubbles stopped, and just had to keep refilling the reservoir, so I did it on my own. Once I got everything all together though and started backing up and going forward and trying to adjust that tension adjuster arm in there, it really didn't seem like it was making a difference. The brakes work fine, but you could tell when you pulled the emergency brake they had to pull it quite a bit before they started to engage. So I ended up taking the tires off again and adjusting that screw assembly in there. So for adjusting the screw assembly, I didn't mention it before, but when I put it on, I put them on pretty loose with the intention of adjusting it after the fact on the car. So maybe I think I just had it way too loose, because you end up having to turn it out about 1/4 of an inch. Anyway, so what I did is when I adjusted it by hand, the inside of the brake drum is the diameter you want it to be, basically. So when you put that brake drum over it, you can feel where the brake shoes are just with the back of your fingers here. So I just kept adjusting it until it was basically just at that point. So to adjust it, let's just move the camera over. Come on, you got this. Maybe not. I have to cut this bit out. Anyway, to adjust this is going to take a second. You reach down in here and you see where the adjustment arm is. It does it automatically, and you pull that away like that. Because if it's in place, it makes it a lot harder to turn this little screw here. So this screw here is what adjusts the distance between the two to keep the brakes pushed out. But when you look at it, initially you're going to think that this is going to screw into this body. So to adjust it out, you're going to want to push it up. But actually it's not that case. This screw here is the only thing that moves. This part floats over here. So to adjust the brakes outward, you're going to want to roll this downward like that while you're holding that arm back. And then you just keep doing that and holding the brake drum up to it until it seems like it's a good fit. So once it was a good fit, the tires were put back on. Drove around the block a couple times. There was a odd noise, and it actually was coming from the front end, and that's because it was setting up for about a week, so there was a bunch of rust on the rotors on the front. But once that was taken care of, everything worked fine. Definitely a big difference when you pull the emergency brake, how far you have to pull it before you start to feel it engage. So, you know, huge difference. Everything's working fine on this. Just wanted to share those couple more tips and tricks, you know, things that I didn't mention in the first video, to help someone that was doing this on their own. And one other point, I was careful to inspect the brake lines after taking it for its, you know, 3-4 mile inaugural drive to make sure that none of the fittings were leaking. Everything seems to be holding tight, so I'll just check up on that probably in a couple months just to make sure that nothing has gone awry in the meantime.